slides to
PowerPoint too. Well, welcome back. Didn't look like either. It looks like we wore them out and they're gone. No, here they're coming back in. So this is probably one of my most favorite parts of what's taken place. And what we're going to talk about here in a minute is actually if your friends and neighbors want to know what WGA does, and they do a lot of things, but this is perhaps one of the things that in my mind, they have been as successful as anything. And we all know the West, you know, what it's made up of, you know, and we're right in the heart of the inland West where, you know, the forests and the lakes and the incredible natural resources that are here. And I'm going to talk about them in a little bit to a different group, but you know, we have over the years, and a lot of it has been just a lot of it's science, but a lot of it's common sense, that forest health, particularly emphasized by the catastrophic fires that we've had, and the bugs, and you name it, whatever it may be, but you know, attitudes, you know, kind of ebb and flow in that area. But in my mind, the general consensus of the necessity for really good forest health has gone way up. It wasn't like somebody flipped a switch on. It was gradual. A lot of it was the research that was done, you know, the research that was done by the universities, changes in practices by the timber industry. But it always accelerated when we had one of those nasty summers. Tom, you'd think there'd be some wood up here for me to knock on this panel, but that has really accelerated it. So we're very blessed that when we talk about forest health restoration, that we've got 4 panelists. Why don't, Tom, you say you had some slides. Let me introduce Tom, who's a vice president and used to be director of the Department of Lands in Idaho. And before that, he was in Montana. Tom's worked on forestry issues for over 20 years and has a deep understanding, particularly of the issue that we're about to discuss. So, Tom, why don't you go, and I'll introduce the rest of you in a minute. So,
thanks, Governor. So I'm Tom Schultz with Idaho Forest Group. Just a quick plug for who we are. We operate 5 sawmills in central and north Idaho. We've got a finger joint plant in Athol, and we have a mill in western Montana. We employ about 1,100 folks across the Intermountain, and we purchase logs in Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. So the purpose of these slides is just to kind of give a perspective on what this panel is likely going to be covering, looking at forest infrastructure and some of the threats, challenges, and opportunities. So these are just a couple slides to kind of get us thinking about these issues as we move forward. Key piece to take in mind, different than many other states, is the heavy footprint of the federal government in Idaho. You'll see that there's over 21 million acres of forest land in Idaho, and about 76% of it is owned and managed by the federal government. State has another 6%. So when you think about the impact that has on counties and rural communities, our ability to have certainty of supply, jobs, and those things is heavily dependent on partnerships with the federal government. You'll see that about 45% of the base that we have is actually manageable. When you look at the Forest Service alone, it's about 35% in the Intermountain that we can actually manage as suitable timber. So 65% of the forest land, of federal forest land, is really off limits to timber production. So keep that in mind as we talk about these slides, but this is a key piece. Only 14% is private. So you've heard the terms. I think we heard different terms. We have workforce issues. We have education issues, but I really think we have a crisis in the forest. You heard the governor talk about forest health. Just a couple things to touch on. What's happened in the last, even just 10 years, the amount of mortality has increased substantially. Based on Forest Service data that's been taken, the fires have increased. We've got stands that are much more dense and overgrown than they have been historically. So we've got conditions on the landscape that there's estimates that over 70% of the national forest are in some need of restoration treatments. So the need for treatment is significant when you look at what's going on. And just some of the data sets, if you take a look at this slide here, this is the entire Intermountain, and this includes everything from Arizona, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, Utah, Wyoming. But just the general trends and what we've seen is where growth peaked on the forest lands up until about the late 80s, early 90s, and since then, you see the growth rate has gone down substantially. The mortality is that brown bar. Mortality is eclipsing growth, and we actually now have negative growth rates on many of our forest lands. So what negative growth rates tell you is that we actually have more mortality than we have growth. There's more trees dying in the forest than we are removing the trees, and the numbers are pretty sad. When you look at Montana alone, for every 1 cubic foot of wood that we harvest in Montana, about 6 cubic feet die in the forest. In Idaho, the relationship is 1 to 3. For every 1 cubic foot we harvest in Idaho, 3 cubic feet die in the forest. And a lot of this you just see happening in just the last 10 years, this significant increase in mortality. So what can we do? The governor's been a leader on this. I would say Idaho has led the country on these issues, but shared stewardship is one issue. Good neighbor authority is another one, some of the policies that have been enacted. But we have a shared stewardship agreement that after the WGA agreement was signed in Hawaii in December of 18, Idaho signed the first shared stewardship agreement, and there's a commitment in there to doubling the acres treated. So we've been able to quantify what that looks like, and right now we have about approximately 50,000 acres a year that are treated on national forests in Idaho, and we believe with the state's assistance we can double that over time. So that's the goal, and you don't see those kind of commitments in any other shared stewardship agreement like you see in the Idaho agreement. Challenges. This is a slide that was put together from folks at the University of Montana, but this gives you a good snapshot as what's happened with manufacturing capacity in the Intermountain. This is Idaho and Montana, so you'll see since 1988 we've had a 65% decrease in the number of sawmills in the two states. Capacity per mill, however, has gone up. So in Idaho the capacity has really increased almost 140% over that same period of time. But then when you look at the total capacity to basically manufacture in the region, we're down. So Montana's got about almost a 60% decrease in total mill capacity, and in Idaho it's down about 16%. So that green bar is total capacity in that state. The red line are the number of sawmills, and then the blue is the actual capacity per mill. So what you've seen over time is an increase in the use of technology to increase capacity at the various mills. The number of mills are down, the number of jobs are down, but you just see there's a difference in what's happened in Idaho and Montana, and part of that story we'll get to, I'm sure, with some of the questions. Okay, here we go. Just a couple things. What happens when you have fewer mills? Job losses, the huge impacts to counties. We've seen the payments to counties go down. There's been efforts with secure rural schools payments to help offset some of that. But I would argue that those payments, whereas I know they're appreciated by the counties, they don't supplant the loss in income from those original 25% payments. Forest health has decreased significantly. Restoration work, there's a huge need to restore the forest. You see with the loss of infrastructure, there's greater distance for travel that has impacts on road systems. You see hours for truck drivers increasing. We have concerns over some quality of life issues for truck drivers, increased costs, and also certainty of log supply. We heard earlier about certainty of supply for biomass for some of those issues. Same thing with logs. We cannot make investments in sawmills without certainty of supply. To build a new sawmill, it's going to cost more than $100 million, so that's a significant capital investment to do that. Solutions. Got to make a plug for the new arena at the University of Idaho. Idaho Central Credit Union arena. This is to be manufactured out of wood, engineered wood. The groundbreaking occurred this spring. We have the Dean of the College of Natural Resources here. But this is going to be a showcase arena, not just for the Pacific Northwest, I would say for the country. We see an expanding opportunity for markets for mass timber. We talked about biofuels a little bit previously, and also nanofibers. So we're a part of a consortium of companies and universities that were looking at displacing use of plastics, petroplastics with bioplastics and biocomposites. So that's another opportunity for expanding that. Mass timber projects, you start seeing what's happening around the country. The governor made mention of a company in southern Idaho. There's actually 3 companies in the Boise area and Meridian that are actually manufacturing homes, multifamily housing that they're shipping both to the West Coast and down in the Southwest. So a lot of that manufacturing is being done in Idaho with wood, and I would argue that wood is a renewable resource. Not only does it store carbon, but it's something that is it's aesthetically pleasing to look at, and we see more and more growth in this arena. Finally, there was a last piece on this kind of sustainability issue. We start seeing companies around the country and around the globe have focused more on sustainability, and I would argue that's what's probably going to drive some of the changes in renewables, probably more so than government regulation, is the private sector stepping up through their own commitments to sustainability. And there was a study done by the Nature Conservancy about a year ago that looked at how do you have an impact on climate change, and they came up with various things to look at, and that the term is natural climate solutions. And the top 2 things that can be done. First one is reforestation, and the second one is longer rotations on trees. So the top 2 natural climate solution opportunities that exist worldwide are forestry related. So as we talk about climate change and impacts, what we can do without regulation, but with natural systems and how we incentivize landowners, those are things to take into consideration. So hopefully these slides will provoke some discussion and thought as we go through. Thanks, Governor.
Thank you, Tom. Cheryl Probert, in my, as we worked on Good Neighbor Authority and shared stewardship, Cheryl, who's supervisor of the Nez Perce-Clearwater, I'm being enough of a bureaucrat, I'm starting to talk like one, take all the last syllables out of all the words, located in north central Idaho, but she's worked for the Forest Service around the West, but on this issue that Tom and I just talked about, she really has been a leader, and we appreciate her very much. So Cheryl?
Thank you, Governor. Really appreciate that, and happy to be here to represent the agency and the changes that we've done. And indeed, Tom, as I first hit Idaho in 1990 on the Targhee, I was coming in the door as a range con as the foresters and engineers and were headed out the door, and we were retraining them and in the shift in the timber industry. And the mills were closing, and we were trying to figure out as an agency what we were becoming. And even as those skill sets were leaving, we were realizing that we needed them for this restoration picture. And so it wasn't that we were salvaging lodgepole pine in the Idaho caldera. It was that we had to restore aspen and remove Doug fir. We had to reduce fire and fuel loading, and we were searching for the infrastructure to help us do that. And I spent time in western Nevada, I've spent time in eastern California, and then in Utah and western Wyoming, where we were challenged with this same issue of how do we get back our infrastructure, how do we partner to get to address our forest restoration issues. And then I got to come back to Idaho, and somehow I got lucky enough to get on a forest where things were still active, where we still had an opportunity to grow an existing infrastructure. And so I've been really reflecting on what has been different, and what made us able to be successful on the Nez Perce-Clearwater, even when we had gone on that, the year that I was born, the Nez Perce and the Clearwater National Forest sold about 430 million board feet. The year my oldest son graduated from high school, they sold 7 million. Yet, and now in 2019, we're up over 80 million. So somehow we were able to sustain a timber infrastructure, even in the wake of that kind of a dramatic reduction in what was going off on the National Forest. And it really was about the relationships between the National Forest, private industry, and working creatively to kind of redefine some industry pieces. So we also had catastrophic floods that we needed people that could help restore roads. So who better to help restore roads than the people that actually built them in the beginning? So we were able to really create a more diverse industry in terms of overall restoration on the forest. And it was forced upon us by floods, so I don't know where you take that analogy, but but we couldn't do it ourselves. And I think you mentioned, I don't know how many times, if we would just get out of our silos. So as I was really thinking about the successes that we've had on the Nez Perce-Clearwater recently and in the past, that's one of the most key components, is getting out of the forest, seeing the forest, getting outside of, the Forest Service. We have pride in being a can-do agency, but I would say in my entire career, we've really shifted into an agency that facilitates getting work done across boundaries, and that's how we've gotten a lot of success in recent years. So the 7 forests in Idaho in the last 5 years have significantly increased the amount of timber harvest that we've been doing on National Forest System lands. We've done that through Good Neighbor Authority. We've done that through using other authorities like Stewardship Contracting, which again, it's an area where we talk about goods for services, and we are opening up and allowing the timber industry to do those other services around aquatic restoration and other work out there on the ground. So it's really what has made us successful, and I think will continue to make us successful as we move for FY20 national target of 3.2 billion board feet off National Forest System lands. It's going to be that recognizing that we're connected, working together, and really trying new horizons. And this idea of how we bring investors into National Forest System and forest restoration work, how we become partners and players in that arena is a really new frontier for us. I was just recently at a training that was on conservation financing and how the Forest Service is transforming the way we look at how we get our work done into a whole new arena there. So with that, I'm excited for the questions.
Well, thank you, Cheryl. Chelsea Pennick McIver is a policy analyst for PAG, the Policy Analyst Group at the University of Idaho. I just want you all to know what a bureaucrat I'm becoming. She has published multiple articles on forest products industry in the West and serves on the leadership team for Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition. Chelsea.
Thank you, Governor. It's great to be here. Good morning. So a little bit about PAG, about the Policy Analysis Group. It's been around for about 30 years. It was established by the legislature. It's very unique in that sense. There are not many entities like it, and we receive funding from the legislature that allows us to provide timely, scientific, objective data and analysis on resource and land use issues. On behalf of, or on topics of interest to residents of Idaho. And it's very unique, I guess, in this sense. I've worked for other research units. You know, the provision of state funding allows us to be nimble. It allows us to respond to questions as they're happening when they're pertinent. And that's something that I think is really valuable about the organization. And then, as the governor mentioned, I am also on the leadership team for the Rural Voices for Conservation Coalition, and that is a multi-issue, multi-state coalition of over 80 community-based organizations from across the West, working to advance natural resource policy solutions that represent what we like to call the radical middle. And all of this work is really personal to me. I grew up in a rural town in North Idaho, just about an hour north of here. I'm from a Forest Service family. You know, these issues are ones that I have lived through, having lived through the timber wars of the 90s, having lived through budget shortfalls at the county level. I can tell you as a quick anecdote that the school in my small town was condemned the year before I started kindergarten. And as a result, and the county did not have the money to build a new school, so I spent the first 4 years of my education in makeshift classrooms that consisted of split trailers, the gymnasium at the high school in the nearby town, and the locker rooms at the high school football field. And so you know, county finances, community economies, they're all really important at multiple levels, and they tie a lot of things together. So I'm looking forward to talking about them more.
Good. And I do want to add a little pitch for the Policy Analyst Group. When I talked about earlier, some of the baseline work that was done on forest health that actually over the years, it really, I think, attitudinally changed was a combination of their work and the forest industry, Forest Products Commission, getting that word out, because they do polling every year. Do they still do polling, Sean? I think so. And the polling in Idaho, as far as the issue of forest health, isn't even on the Richter screen. Everybody's bought into this. This is a consensus issue. Now we just got to get it done. So with that, Matt Krumenauer is the Vice President of Special Projects of the U.S. Endowment for Forests and Communities. Matt leads the Endowment's Wood to Energy initiative, and I'm sure he's going to want to talk about digesters, and is working on the ground to accelerate market development for new and innovative uses of forest products. So, Matt.
Great, thank you very much, Governor, and it's great to be back here in Idaho. You know, it's actually a pretty exciting time, I think, for our forests. And Tom mentioned some of the challenges that we've seen, and those have been, you know, decades in the making. But there's also some really exciting things happening, and I think we're seeing a change in our sort of body politic as people embrace the sustainability of wood as a building material. People are understanding more about the health impacts of wildfires and becoming more aware of what we need to do and how we can work together with our communities and our federal agencies and others to address this. So I'm actually really excited about the work that we get to do and this topic. It's pretty exciting. Just real briefly, the U.S. Endowment is a 501c3 public charity. We were formed in 2006 with proceeds from a trade settlement between the U.S. and Canadian governments. We are a sort of a broad mission-based organization to keep working forests as forests and benefit rural forest risk communities and support family wage jobs. We do that by implementing a number of different initiatives. We support research and development in traditional lumber and forest products manufacturing. We put a lot of work into improving the building codes to allow for taller wood buildings and supporting a lot of the R&D behind some of the cross-laminated timber and mass timber efforts. We've done, we sort of believe that forest markets are founded on innovation, and that we invest and promote new technologies to help develop markets to assure that forest values can be achieved, and that those values can help drive conservation practices and keep forests productive, keep them valuable for their landowners, and keep them as forests for the long term. Of course, water is the most valuable forest product there is, and we do a lot of work trying to monetize ecosystem services to try to promote the value of that system and those resources, and use that as a way to help keep those forests as forests for the long term. We function in a partnership model. We're a nonprofit, but we have our own capital, and we don't do traditional retail fundraising like some other organizations do, but we try to view ourselves as society's risk capital, and we try to invest the mission dollars that we have to address those kind of societal problems, and we really try to do that in partnership, primarily with federal and state agencies. And so we're pretty excited to be part of this conversation and to see if we can help advance these solutions.
Well, thank you. Cheryl, I got to go back, and if you look at Tom's slides and the number of mills, and you know, I love the trajectory right now, other than to treat the 5 or 6 million acres of forest ground we got a long way to go. You know, as long as you're getting better every year, but we're going to have to get better faster to avoid the next, what I think might be a catastrophic event. But how do I give, Tom's company's pretty well financed, but how do I give a banker confidence that if they finance a new mill in well, Targhee's a good example, in that area, that they'll, given your experience with the Forest Service, that they'll have a sustainable supply to where some group or company can finance a mill, and more importantly, that Idaho families that haven't been in the logging business or that are in the logging business and thinking about getting out of it will stay there to be the workforce they need to do those forest health projects. How do I give them that confidence?
That it's a great question. I think that there's no one answer in terms of how we can really solidify. I think that supply chain is really where the Forest Service comes in very heavily in terms of being a more sure supply. And part of our challenge is with our environmental planning and processes, and the Forest Service has been at a national level really emphasizing streamlining more efficient processes, both in terms of how we do our environmental planning and how we do our implementation out on the ground. Good Neighbor Authority helps us with that because it provides additional capacity in both the implementation and the planning end of things. We've got several examples across the nation that we're getting much better at sharing on how we look at larger landscapes, how we can do condition-based NEPA. We've got a lot more tools in our planning toolbox that Western Governors Association and a lot of our federal representatives have been incredible advocates for us to give us those tools. And you know, we also have contracting. We have 20-year stewardship agreement authority now, and we need to figure out how to enter into that world more as an agency, and how we can work better with our very own, talk about breaking down silos. You know, we have different deputy chief areas, and this is this issue we're talking about right now is really where research and development, our state and private forestry, and national forest systems need to get working together better to help answer that question. I think we've made a lot of strides. Projects like the Fry project in Arizona, all across Idaho, with you've got pretty much on all of the western forests in Idaho, you have examples of large scaling up our analyses. Hopefully within 6 months in Nez Clear, we'll have over 500 million board feet of shelf stock for the first time in anybody's memory. So we are working that side, and I think that's the place that we're really going to be able to be helpful in providing some surety.
Well, I think if every supervisor had your dedication to this issue, that that graph of Tom's would look a little better because of what we had out in the, and it's infectious. It's gone from a couple of the forests up here, but it's, the rate of progress isn't as fast as I'd like to see it, but I'm often called an impatient person. So, Tom, what do you think the next steps are to get up to a more scalable level of supply?
So on the supply issue, I guess back to the question you just had with Cheryl, I mean, the thing I always try to look at is before we try to encourage new investment, let's look at the existing infrastructure and have a discussion with those mills in the area. So the Jensens, the Sun Mountains, the RYs that potentially could reach into Targhee, and talk to those folks first and foremost. But their first question is going to be, is the supply there? And then is it a 10-year contract? Is it a 20-year contract? And then beyond that, I think the issue is going to be, is the workforce there? And then I think we've got contractors, you know, Sean's here and represents the logging and the trucking contractors, but do we have that workforce to sustain that? So, but I think first and foremost, let's talk to the existing mill owners in the region and get their input before we try to bring in new folks to operate in an area that you have to invest all new capital. What opportunities for them exist? So, but in terms of the supply issue, this is a great question. The trajectory where we're headed, I have a graph that I like to show sometimes, but when you look at nationally, on the national forest peaked in about 1988, 1989. The volume that was harvested off the national forest was over 12 billion board feet. For the last 10 years, we've been averaging about 2.2 billion board feet. There's been an 80% reduction, and this is a great slide right here that kind of shows you the volume that has changed over time, and it's juxtaposed against forest fires. So you go back to the 1980s, and you run about 1980 through 2000, where we're burning nationally somewhere probably averaging about 5 million acres a year. Timber harvest peaked in about 1988. Timber harvest came down significantly over the next 10 to 20 years. And then what we've seen at the same time is as that's come down, we've seen the forest fire picture increase. So you can say it's climate change, you can say it's drought, you can say it's insect and disease. The other piece you cannot take away, though, is with the lack of active management, there has been an increase in forest fires. There is a correlation there. And what we've seen in the last 10 years, we've seen 3 seasons in the last 10 years, we've burned more than 10 million acres nationally. So how do we get that active management piece back up, which is your question? So how do we get back? Maybe we're not going to get to 12 billion board feet nationally, but if you take the ASQ, which is the allowable sale quantity, so every forest plan has a volume target in it. If the forest were to be managed sustainably, that number nationally, if we could get to 6 billion board feet, and you'll hear the Secretary talk about this number sometimes, 6 billion board feet represents every national forest in the U.S. basically complying with their forest plan. And you heard Cheryl just mention we're trying to get to 3.2 this year, and there's actually the President had an executive order last year that came out advocating for about 4.8. So the Forest Service is on a trajectory to get closer to that 6 billion board feet, which represents the number in every forest plan around the country. So, but how do we do that? And I would argue that the Forest Service cannot do it alone. We need to work with the local collaboratives, and we have a very vigorous, healthy collaboration across multiple forests in Idaho. Even there's one on the Caribou Targhee right now that we're actually involved in helping establish that, even though we don't source wood out of there. We're trying to get that collaborative spirit going. So you need collaboration. I think you have to have good data. You have to have willingness. You talked about leadership in the forest. You've got to have that. But I think you have to have state participation. I would argue Region 1's goal right now is about 500 million board feet in the next 2 to 3 years. and they've been hovering somewhere mid 300s. They hit just over 400 million feet this last year. They actually exceeded their target as a region. But their goal is 500 million feet in the next 2 years. There's no way they're going to get to 500 million feet without the state's participation. So I've tried to boil down how we do this. You involve the states, not to take over federal lands, but to assist in a cooperative management, and cooperative federalism is the term that I like to use, to manage federal lands. And the states, I think, should be doing 20% of the harvest on federal lands. So in Idaho, in Region 1, so what that means is 100 million feet out of that 500 million feet should be coming from IDL and should be coming from DNRC in Montana. And I think Idaho can step up and easily do 70 to 80 million feet of federal timber on those lands. So of 20%, I think the way you get to that larger number of 6 billion board feet nationally, you've got to engage the states. And the leadership that Idaho has taken, even under your leadership of shared stewardship, we see an effort all across the Pacific Northwest right now. There's actually a meeting this week among the 4 Northwest states to talk about Good Neighbor Authority, lessons learned, and how they continue to expedite and move things forward. But I'm convinced that without collaboration, without strong leadership from the states and good leadership and cooperation from the Forest Service, we can't get there. But with those things, I think we can get to those targets that the Forest Service is setting, and I think we can do it in a way that's responsible. I mentioned all of the forest decay that's happening. We've got to address it, and the only way to do it is through cooperation.
Well, Chelsea, I'm going off script, so be careful. One of the graphs that Tom showed earlier talked about carbon and sequestration. Your predecessor at the Policy Analyst Group, and I used to get into pretty robust debates about, we used to have a committee in Idaho called the Sequestration. We actually had a program for sequestration that was run through the NRCS, the Soil Conservation Service. And if you go back and look at the research that's been done on forest sequestration, because on Tom's graph, it was up there as one of the things, carbon cycle was a big thing. What's the state of the state of the art on how active forest management sequesters carbon compared to no management or obviously fires?
Is this back on? Yeah. Well, I'm afraid you're asking the wrong person. This is not my area of expertise. I think the only thing that I can, credibly tie it back to is talking about wood products and the role that wood products play in storing carbon. They play a really important role. It wasn't necessarily the top 2 on that graph. And we do have that expertise within the Policy Analysis Group. We do have folks that are working on carbon. It's just not me.
So we'll go to your level, your area of expertise. Those of us that deal in the public arena in Idaho are always hearing about secure rural schools and PILT payments. And how does if you've got a timbered county or community and their base, because of the years in the 80s when it was get out the cut, their base for their original SRS payment was predicated on that base. How far back to that base do you need to go that will generate the revenue to the schools and the county roads to make up for the SRS money?
So if I understand your question, you're wondering, in the absence of SRS, what it would take to generate revenues on national forests to essentially get back to that one, the 1980, the high 3 level that SRS payments are currently based on. It would take a lot. Policy Analysis Group recently completed a study where we were looking at projecting out and modeling some of the efforts that are happening in Idaho under shared stewardship to double harvest on national forest lands. And I took that and looked at, well, what impact might that have then on counties and county payments, given that right now counties are under a scenario where they are receiving 25% payments, not SRS payments, until those until that legislation gets renewed. And I can tell you that it makes very little difference, unfortunately. And part of that has to do with the way the SRS and or 25% fund payments and PILT, payment in lieu of taxes payments, the way that they operate in tandem, such that when one goes up, the other goes down. So in some ways, they're always sort of counterbalancing each other. So if revenues on national forests were to increase as a result of the, doubling of harvest, assuming that markets are strong and stumpage prices are good, right? That the counties would see a small increase. Some counties would see a small increase in their overall their 25% fund payment, but it's a drop in the bucket. It's a small percentage of what they had received in the 80s.
I got to follow that up. Speaking of silos, there's that check that comes from the Treasury to the county, but what about, does your modeling show what happens if you've got small family logging operations and you've got companies buying tires for the logging selling tires for the logging trucks, and the more macro part of it compared to just the check that comes into the county? Where does that balance out?
Right. So that's a really good point. County payments are just one small piece of the picture, and there's a lot of economic activity that's generated from all along the supply chain. Although we also know that since the 1980s, there's been a lot of efficiency gains. There's fewer people are employed for every million board feet of timber that is produced, and so again, just increasing the harvest back to those rates is still not going to have the same employment and economic impacts as it might have at that time.
But also what, along with that increase in efficiency, is the fact that whether it's a small independent logger or Tom, because of the sophistication of the logging equipment and the sophistication of the mills, the paycheck and the standard of living of their employees is a lot higher, and it's a lot safer too. So, how do you model that into, a check from the federal government versus jobs? I think Cheryl's dying to jump in.
Did I? Yeah, I kind of looked that way, huh? Well, I think the other piece of that picture really, and you were kind of getting at it, but there's all these ancillary activities and all this ancillary work. Nothing we do on the National Forest really is just about cutting trees and putting them on logs and moving them down the road. We have all this restoration work that we are doing, and so that's a piece of that contribution as well. And we talk a lot about stewardship contracting, and though that money doesn't actually go into the county payments, yet it goes back directly into reinvestment in the local area, in the resources. So on the Nez Clear, we were running about, part of the success was getting out of the litigation cycle by shifting to stewardship contracting so that we could then use goods for services, basically. The timber paid for all this other aquatic restoration work. That was a way that we could bring people along and start increasing our work. So about 80% of our program went to that, which the numbers aren't clear, but we put about 32 between 2011 and 2018, $32 million worth of timber revenue. 15 million of that went directly into stewardship projects. About 15 million of that went into what we call retained receipts, which then we can turn around, contract out to do work that meets different land management goals. And by and large, the people that get those contracts are the small local contractors. Even when a large company like IFG buys the stewardship sale, they're still subbing out a lot of that work to our local folks in our rural communities, and it's been a real strength of the program.
I think if I can, that's one of the reasons we focus on market development. because as you saw from some of Tom's slides, the supply profile off of national forests has changed, and the infrastructure needed to process that material has declined. And so we need to be able to develop markets for some of this smaller diameter, lower value material. We need to be able to continue to grow markets for traditional lumber products and pursue some of these new developments like nanocellulose or some of these energy markets. Because with those steady, stable markets, it provides sort of a positive feedback loop back to the Forest Service, because they can be able to build longer term stability into their planning processes, get out ahead of the environmental analysis a little bit. The collaboratives can certainly engage and support and see success that feeds back into the schools, into the counties, into the local municipalities. But it also provides that certainty for not only companies like IFG and the smaller contractors who are the real job creators, but allows them that certainty to be able to finance the type of equipment that's needed to actually manage the forest in the first place. So I think it's what you're hearing from a lot of us is that this is a pretty complex system, but we kind of know all the pieces, and they're starting to come together. And I think that's what's pretty exciting, is that we're seeing the Forest Service deploy more and more tools. We're seeing the states deploy tools like GNA. We're seeing the collaboratives really be able to engage in a proactive way to help get this work done. And so we're starting to see longer term contracts. 10 years, we're going to learn from those. We're going to see 20-year contracts. And that's the type of work we need to be able to really see the private sector step in to make the investment needed.
Tom, but I want to ask about those 20-year contracts. Do they get a exemption from NEPA challenges?
Not yet. We can work on that one.
All right.
So, Governor, I did have a response to your question about taxes. We've done some work to forecast if we could increase the harvestable volume off federal lands in Idaho by 200 million feet. That would result in about $25 million in new taxes generated to the state. It would increase jobs by about 5,000 jobs. So to put that in perspective, back at the height of the late 80s when I showed you that national trend of about 12 billion board feet, in Idaho we were harvesting on federal lands about 800 million feet. We've probably averaged somewhere between 100 and 150 million feet over the last 10 to 15 years. So adding 200 million feet on top, roughly doubling the harvest off of federal lands, still would be less than half of where we were in the late 80s. So your question, what would it take in terms of a harvest level to get back to those initial 25% payments? You'd have to be close to 800 million feet. And we're averaging about 150 right now. So if we could at least just get to 300 or 400, which your question earlier about supply is going to take more work, more cooperation, more investment from the states. We can get there, but it's going to move the needle, and we're moving the needle. There is such a need on the restoration side of this, like we've talked about. You've got a need, you've got a willingness, you've got leadership. I would say the limiting factor right now to increasing supply is a commitment of resources. What we see is under shared stewardship, for instance, there is no federal money yet associated with shared stewardship. There's money that's being discussed. A couple states have stepped forward, including Idaho, has gotten some initial commitments of money. But what we saw commitment of funding was with Good Neighbor. We saw the city of Idaho step up and make a commitment of general fund toward Good Neighbor. We've seen the Forest Service step up with Good Neighbor. Idaho received over $600,000 from the federal government. That same commitment that's being discussed in Idaho, it's being discussed in Montana, but we haven't actually seen that. So I think if we can encourage, an encouragement of mine to Western governors would be to support the MOU that was signed in December of last year and encourage commitment of resources from USDA into shared stewardship. And then I think to the extent that the states can step up and invest some seed money, just like industry's done with Good Neighbor, I think that can spur this on. But I think there's a willingness. I think resources are lacking to fully take this to the next level.
Well, I guess, Chelsea, some of the intangibles, Cheryl talked about the projects where they were taken and that they don't get on these GNA sales, that there isn't money that goes back to the county. But how do you allocate for an intangible that you did a watershed project and either saved or restored a critical cutthroat trout, fill in the blank, Um, and you created something there, a more healthy environment. How do you put a number on that? And more importantly, how do you put a number on the fact that you significantly lessen the catastrophic fire risk? If you could monetize those two things, the math would get a lot easier. Has the Policy Analyst Group looked at trying to monetize those two issues?
We haven't, it's not a question that's come to us to look at, but, I would say that, not everything necessarily needs to be quantified. I understand where you're getting at and the value of it. I think we are seeing, though, the benefit of a lot of this work I don't like to use this term, but in the social license that a lot of this work builds in communities to be able to get more work done. I think the project sizes are getting larger. We've seen in some of our work looking at the impact of collaboration in the state of Idaho that the size of projects are getting, not only is the size of projects, the number of acres being treated increasing, but we're seeing that they're much more diverse and much more complex projects. So they're meeting a much greater number of objectives on the landscape. And I think that that can only build on itself and increase across the state and increase those non-tangible benefits.
Thank you. Questions? Well, Matt, while we're waiting for a question, I want to go back to my cut the juniper down to save sage grouse habitat, and I assume that part of that settlement agreement that runs your endowment wasn't from any juniper farmers, but are there other areas where there's been research done on some of these health issues that aren't necessarily traditional forest health, which juniper would be one of those? And other than energy, I don't know what else you do with juniper other than make really, really hard fence posts.
Yeah, we're not making that many pencils out of them anymore
Yeah.
either. Yeah, it's a great question. One of the examples I draw from is a project we're pursuing in Oregon, where we're developing a commercial scale facility to produce a torrefied biofuel that will export to Asia.
What's torrefied?
It's basically like coffee roasting. So it's a treatment you're applying to the biomass to make it more energy dense, and becomes hydrophobic or kind of waterproof. So it becomes a whole lot easier to transport that final product because you've removed the water, you've reduced the need for special transport and storage infrastructure, and you've made it more energy dense, about 20 to 30% more energy dense than a traditional white pellet. And so we've put some effort into trying to develop that market. We're in the process of completing the construction of that facility and seeing if we can prove out a market for a large-scale use of biomass. And if we can accomplish that, we've tested juniper, and that can provide sort of that economic draw for landowners to either offset some of their cost or potentially break even on some of the transport of getting that material off of their landscape and restoring those values. I think one of the things, and some of the folks earlier talked about some of the challenges with biomass, especially on the energy side, is that we need help with it. You can't support the cost of all of these values that we've been talking with on the backs of ratepayers. We've got watershed benefits that we don't really value. We've got health benefits that we don't really accommodate or build into the system. And we need markets, we need localities, we need all of these different interest groups that have values at stake to sort of come together and say, how do we get this done? We picked energy and a large-scale, replacement for coal, basically, as a torrefied fuel because it is that scale that's commensurate with the need. We've seen a lot of these small-scale biomass heating projects that are all really nice projects. We supported one in Southern Oregon that was a small district heating system, and it'll use a couple hundred tons of wood a year. There's not enough buildings in the West to demand the need that we have on our national forest system. So we're looking for those solutions, but I think we need to look at them as sort of an integrated set of values and figure out how do we actually get the money to address the need that we have. Markets is one of those. You brought up a really good point in the earlier panel about insurance and trying to think creatively about who benefits from these activities, and then how do we take that and build that back into the system. You know, the Forest Service is beginning to look more at conservation finance and sort of innovative financing mechanisms where they're putting out, there's groups that are looking at bonds that would be repaid from the water users, from the water utilities themselves, but the money from those bonds would actually go to improve the health of the forests in those watersheds. And so there's a lot of innovations happening, but that's where we're starting to sort of see all these different areas come together in ways that hopefully we can start to take these activities to a much, much larger scale.
Good, if I could just follow up on that too. Matt talked about innovations. The other piece of innovation is on the technology side, not only within the sawmills, but in the logging contractor and even trucking realms. I want to make sure that when we leave today that the perception of the forest products industry in Idaho, it's strong. It is innovative, it's technology driven, and it's an industry that we see growing into the future. There's a lot of interest in what's going on. For instance, in some of the mills that we're invested in, we have a CT scanner. So no different than if you break your leg and go in and get a CT scan, we can actually CT scan logs. And our owner, Mark Brinkmeyer, likes to say we like to saw from the inside out. We can actually see the knots, the defect inside a log, and then you have an optimal solution as you're milling that log as it goes to the sawmill. So technology investments are significant, and robotics. I mean, a lot of the investments you're going to see in mills with robots in the future are coming from the airline and automobile industries. You're going to see greater interest in hiring technicians and engineers. So even as we see that workforce maybe in the sawmills, it's going to shift. Instead of a guy coming in working for $15 to $16 an hour sweeping floors, you're going to have robots doing some of that work, but you're going to be hiring more engineers and technicians. So the workforce needs are going to shift, but you're going to see, I think, an attraction to many of the younger generation folks that are interested in technology, flying drones, programming robots in sawmills, working to invest in, you talked about the banking community. How do we encourage them to invest in our logging workforce, where you can see tethered logging. We can now log on slopes that are 70 to 80%, where historically you would be reduced to no more than a 30 to 35% slope. Well, now we have technology that allows us to actually operate more safely on areas and access a greater portion of the forest land. But there needs to be dialogue among the banking community, the investment community, the technology community. So the wood products industry is an exciting place to be, and the future in my mind is bright.
Questions? Dean Becker.
Thanks. Dennis Becker, I'm the Dean of the College of Natural Resources, and Tom, I was actually going to ask you that question. And as a college, we produce a lot of students, a lot of future leaders in these areas, and one of the challenges we have is that we can't find enough students. There's 4, 5, 6 jobs for every student I'm graduating right now in this sector. And Cheryl, I guess maybe as a question, I wanted you to follow up and sort of talk about that future workforce for the Forest Service and sort of where that's going in your mind and where we need to be focusing our attention as a university.
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. I was thinking about this in terms of, we are focusing on infrastructure as solid objects, and really there's a piece of the human infrastructure that is equally changing and as big of an issue, if not more, in terms of rebuilding that infrastructure. So from the Forest Service perspective, we are, we find ourselves in a place where our higher skills in the forestry and engineering work that we do, we don't have the workforce because we haven't been developing them. So we're looking for, ways to accelerate that learning, and I think this is really where our potential partnerships with universities, and we've talked about how do we use our hiring practices to build students into that workforce of the future together. And I think this integration piece is one of those critical factors that we need to remodel and rethink how we do our hiring and how we do our training, and really build in that integration. It's in a way going back to the old days, but in a new avenue. I do think one of the most significant challenges that I face as an employer, as you're talking about 4 to 5 people or kids per job, there's a couple of things. One is Forest Service doesn't have the best reputation for being movers and shakers and really creative in this industry. And so we got to shift that, and I think we can do that. But the other piece is we're challenged by the lack of connectivity in our rural communities, just like all our other businesses are. And we need to be bigger players in that arena, and how we can bring our resources and our knowledge to bear. We've talked again with University of Idaho of using some of our federal hiring practices with the university. We have a partnership for interns right now. How do we build that into growing an entire, to use your term, cohort of an interdisciplinary team that has grown up together through the university? How can we basically have the university manage chunks of National Forest System lands? We've got a lot of National Forest System lands. They're a great open classroom, and we have a workforce, ready there to help us with. So those are some of the things I'm thinking to build that workforce of the future.
Lindsay Shirley, Oregon State University, Assistant Director of the Extension Service. And I just want to put a plug in for our panel later on today, where we talk about what land-grant universities can do and other public institutions can do collectively to help respond to these needs, because we can leverage the infrastructure that we already have with place-based faculty and staff through the Extension Service to provide workforce training in rural communities. And so the Grow with Google initiative is a similar thing in partnering with companies like that to create a digital infrastructure to be providing upskilling and retraining that needs to happen, because there's a significant need across the nation for those types of skills. So more to be shared later.
Well, and we still got time for a couple questions, but the more I think about this issue, Cheryl, from the Forest Service standpoint, I got lots of friends that are either current or former Forest Service people, and whether it's shared stewardship or GNA or whatever it is, collaboratives, I know that the uncertainty of going out and working for years on a project and then having one little NEPA challenge turn it upside down, it is if forest health is a big issue to us, we have got to collectively get our arms around this, because I can't think of anything. Well, I used to be a Forest Service permit, and I just threw up my hands and said, I've enough, I just can't handle it. And if we can help solve that Rubik's Cube of how do you do long-term management without disruptions, come to an agreement on what we're going to do on forest health, on fire prevention, on management, I think the applicants you get will go up, because it's that uncertainty. Because I talk to so many Forest Service people say, back in the old days when I could do something, and I think that's very important. So.
Governor, along those lines, there's actually a bill in Congress right now that I would encourage WGA to take a look at. So Daines Feinstein are working on a bill to address one of the issues that's been litigated again recently, the cottonwood issue. Part of it was fixed in the omnibus bill. But so if new information is brought up at any point in time, so let's say a thesis comes out, new information on lynx or bull trout or whatever, grizzly bears, the Forest Service now has a requirement to go back and amend forest plans, and projects can be held up in the interim. So we've got current litigation right now that has the potential impact 150 sales across Region 1 over these issues. So the issue of certainty and litigation is significant, and I know WGA has looked at this issue in the past. They've looked at arbitration as a model, but I would encourage that this issue of litigation is still strong, and particularly in Region 1, we see it's the hotbed of timber sale litigation. So that's something I would encourage WGA to stay invested in that process.
Yeah, if I can add, right on the Nez Clear, even as we were increasing, we lost 2 small mills as a direct or indirect result of adverse litigation. And we've had success, again, it's in that partnering, working together. I have to say our Oregon Community Protection Project that had timber harvest in inventoried roadless right next to a community, and we had the governor, we had the Idaho Association of Counties intervening on the forest behalf, and I don't know, I think I saw Sam here earlier, integral to our success. I'm here to say we would not, I don't believe we would have won were it not for that support from all the sectors, from our collaborative, from the state and the counties supporting the need for that project and the tools that we were doing to do it. So I think that's another real key, is getting and staying engaged throughout the whole process, even through that litigation. It makes a big difference.
Well,
so thank you.
Well, thank you. I want to wrap this up. And I don't want to leave the impression that what's taken place in the West with the Forest Service, with the State Department of Lands, with the timber industry, with Good Neighbor, with shared stewardship, I just, by nature, I'm frustrated that the trajectory is not faster. We are definitely doing the right thing, but it is government that we're dealing with, but there are multiple things that we talked about at this panel that I think are part of the solution. And I will tell you my experience, and I think Jim will echo this. What's taken place here in Idaho, the Good Neighbor Authority is literally a result of Tom's boss and Governor Otter talking to Secretary Vilsack, I think at one of your meetings, and starting this process. So this organization and what we're talking about here is literally going to make a difference for our kids and grandkids about what the West looks like in generations to come. So we got lots of work to do, but we had a good dialogue about it, and I expect to see many more. So thank you very much.